Hello, my friends. Welcome back. We are going to keep reading A Swiftly Tilting Planet by Madeline L'Engle. So yesterday we read the first half of Chapter 8, and Charles Wallace has just been sent within Chuck Maddox, who it turns out is the younger brother of Mrs. O'Keefe. And the children, Chuck and Beezy O'Keefe, are sitting with their grandmother hearing the stories about their names. Zillah comes from your Maddox forebears, the grandmother told the children, and a proud name it is, too. She was an Indian princess, according to your pa, from the tribe which used to dwell right here where we be now, though the Indians are long gone. But you don't know as much about Zillah as you do about Bronwyn. Only that she was an Indian and beautiful. There are too many men on your father's side of the family, and stories come down, nowadays, through women. But in Bronwyn's day, there were men who were bards. What's bards? Chuck asked. Singers of songs and tellers of tales. Both my grandma and my grandpa told me the story of Bronwyn, but mostly my grandma. Over and over, and her grandma told her before that, and the telling goes back beyond memory. Britain and Ireland have long misunderstood each other, and this misunderstanding goes back beyond memory, too. And in the once upon a time and long ago, when the Irish king wooed the English princess, 'twas thought there might at last be peace within the two green and pleasant lands. There was feasting for many moons at the time of the nuptials, and then the Irish king sailed for Ireland with his wife. Wouldn't Bronwyn have been homesick? Beezy asked. And of course she'd been homesick. But she was born a princess, and now she was a queen, and queens knew how to mind their manners, or they did in those days. And the king? What was he like? Oh, and handsome he was, as the Irish can be, as was my own sweet Pat, who bore well the name of the blessed saint, with black hair and blue eyes. Bronwyn knew not he was using her to vent his spleen against her land and her brethren, knew it not until he trumped up some silly story of her sitting in the refectory and casting her eye on one of his men. So, to punish her, for what? Chuck asked. For what, indeed? For his own jealous fantasies. So to punish her, he sent her to tend the swine and barred her from the palace. So she knew he had not ever loved her, and her heart burned within her with anguish. Then she thought to call on her brother in England, and she used the rune, and whether she and hers gave the rune to Patrick, or whether their guardian angels gave it to each of them, she called on all heaven with its power. The children chanted the rune with her. And the sun with its brightness, and the snow with its whiteness, and the fire with all the strength it hath, and the lightning with its rapid wrath, and the winds with their swiftness along their path, and the sea with its deepness, and the rocks with their steepness, and the earth with its starkness, all these I place by God's almighty help and grace between myself and the powers of darkness. The grandmother continued, and the sun shone on her fair hair and warmed her, and the gentle snow fell and made all clean the sty in which the Irish king had set her, and the fire burst from the fireplace of his wooden palace, and the lightning struck it, and it burned with mighty rage, and all within fled the fury. And the wind blew from Britain, and the sails of her brother Bran's ship billowed as it sped over the deep sea, and landed where the rocks were steep and the earth stark. And Bran's men scaled the rock and rescued their beloved Bronwyn. Is it a true story, Grandma? Beezy asked. Really? To those with the listening ear and the believing heart. Chuck has the believing heart, Beezy said. The grandmother patted his knee. One day, maybe, you will be the writer your father wanted to be. He was not cut out for a storekeeper. I love the store, Beezy said defensively. It smells good, of cinnamon and fresh bread and apples. I'm hungry, Chuck said. And wasn't I after saying before we got to get to storytelling that you should go home along for tea? Pull me up, both of you. Chuck and Beezy scrambled to their feet and heaved the old woman upright. We'll pick a bouquet for Ma and Pa on the way, Beezy said. The narrow path was rough with rocks and hammocks of grass, and walking was not easy. The grandmother leaned on a staff which Chuck had cut for her from a grove of young maples which needed thinning. He went ahead, slowing down when he saw Beezy and his grandmother lagging behind him. A bouquet of field flowers was growing in Beezy's hand, for she paused whenever she saw that the old woman was out of breath. Look, Chuck, look, Grandma, 3 more jacks in the pulpit. Chuck was hacking away with his arrowhead at a strand of bittersweet snaking around a young fir tree, strangling it with coils strong as a boa constrictor's. Ma used to have us looking for bittersweet a year or so ago. Now it's taking over. It'll kill this tree unless I cut through it. You two go along, and I'll catch up. Want my knife? Beezy offered. No, my arrowhead's sharp. For a moment, he stared after his sister and grandmother as they wended their slow way. He sniffed the fragrance of the air. Although the apple trees were green, the pink and white blossoms were still on the ground. The scent of lilac mingled with the mock orange. He might be able to hear the trucks on the road and see the planes in the sky, but at least here he couldn't smell them. Chuck liked neither the trucks nor the planes. They all left their fumes behind them, blunting the smell of sunlight, of rain, of green and growing things, and Chuck saw with his nose almost more than with his eyes. Without looking, he could easily tell his parents, his grandmother, his sister, and he judged people almost entirely by his reaction to their odor. "I don't smell a thing," his father said after Chuck had wrinkled his nose at a departing customer. Chuck had said calmly, "He smells unreliable." His father gave a small surprised laugh. "He is unreliable. He owes me more than I can afford to be owed for all his expensive clothes." When the strand of bittersweet was severed, Chuck stood leaning against the rough bark of the tree, breathing in its resiny smell. In the distance, he could see his grandmother and Beezy. The old woman smelled to him of distance, of the sea, which was 50 or more miles away, but perhaps it was a farther sea which clung to her. "And you smell green," he had told her. "Ah, that's because I come from a faraway green country, and the scent of it will be with me always." "What color do I smell?" Beezy had asked. "Yellow, like buttercups and sunlight and butterfly wings. Green and gold, good smells, home smells. His mother was the blue of sky in early morning. His father was the rich mahogany of the highboy in the living room, with the firelight flickering over the polished wood. Comfortable, safe smells. And suddenly, the thought of the odor of cookies and freshly baked bread called to him, and he ran to catch up. The family lived over the store in a long, rambling apartment. The front room, overlooking the street, was a storeroom, filled with cartons and barrels. Behind it were 3 bedrooms, his parents', his own little cubbyhole, and the bigger room Beezy shared with the grandmother. Beyond these were the kitchen and the large, long room which served as living and dining room. There was a fire crackling in the fireplace, for the spring evenings were apt to be chilly. The family was seated about a large round table set for tea, with cookies and bread still warm from the oven, a pitcher of milk, and a big pot of tea covered with the cozy the grandmother had brought with her from Ireland. Chuck took his place, and his mother poured his tea. "Did you save another treat?" "Yes, I really should take Pa's big clippers with me next time." Beezy pushed the plate of bread and butter to him. "Take your share quickly, or I'll eat it all up." Chuck's sensitive nostrils twitched. There was a smell in the room which was completely unfamiliar to him, and of which he was afraid. The father helped himself to a cookie. "This is one of the times I wish Sunday afternoons came more than once a week." "You've been acting tired lately." His wife looked at him anxiously. "Being tired is the natural state of a country storekeeper who doesn't have much business sense." The grandmother moved creakily from her chair at the table to her rocker. "Hard work's not easy. You need more help." "Can't afford it, Grandma. How about telling us a story?" "You've heard them all as many times as there are stars in the sky." "I never tire of them." "I'm told out for today." "Oh, come on, Grandma," Mr. Maddox cajoled. "You never tire of storytelling, and you know you make most of it up as you go along." "Stories are like children. They grow in their own way." She closed her eyes. "I will take just a small snooze." "You tell me about the Indian princess, then, Pa," Beezy ordered. "I don't know much about her as far as provable facts are concerned. My illustrious forebear, Matthew Maddox, from whom I may have inherited an iota of talent, wrote about her in his second novel. It was a bestseller in its day. Sad he couldn't have known about its success, but it was published posthumously. It was a strange sort of fantasy, with qualities which make some critics call it the first American science fiction novel, because it played with time, and he'd obviously heard of Mendel's theories of genetics. Anyhow, Beezy Love, it's a fictional account of the 2 brothers from ancient Wales who came to this country after their father's death, the first Europeans to set foot on the uncharted shores. And as the brothers had quarreled in Wales, so they quarreled in the New World, and the elder of the 2 made his way to South America. Maddox, the younger brother, stayed with the Indians in a place which is nameless, but which Matthew Maddox implies is right around here, and he married the Indian princess Zilla, and in the novel it is his strain which is lost and must be found again. "Sounds interesting," Chuck said. Beezy wrinkled her nose. "I don't much like science fiction. I like fairy tales better." "The Horn of Joy has elements of both. The idea that the proud elder brother must be defeated by the inconsequential but honest younger brother is certainly a fairy tale theme. There was also a unicorn in the story, who was a time traveler." "Why didn't you tell us about it before?" Beezy asked. "Thought you'd be too young to be interested. Anyhow, I sold my copy when I was offered an outrageously large sum for it it was too large an amount to turn down." Matthew Maddox, for a 19th century writer, had an uncanny intuition about the theories of space, time, and relativity that Einstein was to postulate generations later. "But that's not possible," Beezy protested. "Precisely, but it's all in Matthew's book nevertheless. It's an evocative, haunting novel, and since Matthew Maddox assumed he was descended from the younger Welshman, the one who stayed here, and the Indian princess, I followed his fancy. The name Maddox comes from Maddock." A shadow moved across his face. "When my father had a stroke and I had to leave my poet's garret in the city and come help out with the store, I had to give up my dream of following in Matthew's footsteps." "Oh, Pa," Chuck said, "I'm mainly sorry for you children." I never had a chance to prove whether or not I could be a writer, but I'm a failure as a merchant. He rose. I'd better go down to the store for an hour or so and work on accounts. When he left, holding onto the banister as he went down the steep stairs, the smell that made Chuck afraid went with him. Chuck told no one, not even Beezy, about the smell which was in his father, but was not of his father. Twice that week, Chuck had nightmares. When he cried out in terror, his mother came hurrying, but he told her only that he had had a bad dream. Beezy wasn't put off so easily. You're worried about something, Chuck. There's always something to worry about. Lots of people owe Pa money. He's worried about bills. I heard a salesman say he couldn't give Pa any more credit. Beezy said, You're too young to worry about things like that. Anyhow, it isn't the kind of thing you worry about. I'm getting older. Not that old. Pa's giving me more to do. I know more about the business now. But that's not what you're worried about. He tried another tack. I don't like the way Patty O'Keefe's always after you in school. Patty O'Keefe's repeated 6th grade 3 times. He may be good at baseball, but I'm not one of the girls who thinks the sun rises and sets on him. Maybe that's why he's after you. He had succeeded in deflecting her attention. I don't let him near me. He never washes. What does he smell like, Chuck? Like a dandruffy woodchuck. One evening, after supper, Beezy said, Let's go see if the fireflies are back. It was Friday, and no school in the morning, so they could go to bed when they chose. Chuck felt an overwhelming desire to get out of the house, away from the smell, which nearly made him retch. Let's go. It was still twilight when they reached the flat rock. They sat, and the stones still held the warmth of the day's sun. At first, there were only occasional sparkles, but as it got darker, Chuck was lost in a daze of delight as a galaxy of fireflies twinkled on and off, flinging upward in a blaze of light, dropping earthward like falling stars, moving in continuous, effervescent dance. Oh, Beezy, he cried, I'm dazzled with gorgeousness. Behind them, the woods were dark with shadows. There was no moon, and a thin veil of clouds hid the stars. If it were a clear night, Beezy remarked, the fireflies wouldn't be as bright. I've never seen them this beautiful. She lay back on the rock, looking up at the shadowed sky, then closing her eyes. Chuck followed suit. Let's feel the twirling of the earth, Beezy said. That's part of the dance the fireflies are dancing to. Can you feel it? Chuck squeezed his eyelids, tightly closed. He gave a little gasp. Beezy, I feel as though the earth had tilted. He sat up, clutching at the rock. It made me dizzy. She gave her bubbling little giggle. It can be a bit scary, being part of earth and stars and fireflies and clouds and rocks. Lie down again. You won't fall off, I promise. He leaned back, feeling the radiance soak into his body. The rock is still warm. It's warm all summer because the trees don't shade it, and there's a rock in the woods that's always cool, even on the hottest day, because the leaves are so close together the sun's fingers never touch it. Chuck felt a cold shadow move over him and shuddered. Someone walk over your grave? Beezy asked lightly. He jumped up. Let's go home. Why? What's wrong? It's so beautiful. I know, but let's go home. When they got back, everything was in confusion. Mr. Maddox had collapsed from pain and had been rushed to the hospital. The grandmother was waiting for the children. The frightening smell had exploded over Chuck with the violence of a mighty wave as he entered. The grandmother pulled the children to her and held them. But what is it? What's wrong with Pa? Beezy asked. The ambulance attendant thought it was his appendix. But will he be all right? She pleaded. Dear my love, we'll have to wait and pray. Chuck pressed against her, quivering, not speaking. Slowly, the smell was dissipating, leaving a strange emptiness in its wake. Time seemed to stand still. Chuck would glance at the clock, thinking an hour had passed, only to find it barely a minute. After a long while, Beezy fell asleep, her head in their grandmother's lap. Chuck was watchful, looking from the clock to the telephone to the door, but at length, too, he slept. In his sleep, he dreamed he was lying on the flat rock and feeling the swing of the earth around the sun, and suddenly the rock tilted steeply, and he was sliding off, and he scrabbled in terror to keep from falling off the precipice into a sea of darkness. He cried out, Rocks! Steep! And the grandmother put her hand on the rock and steadied it, and he stopped dreaming. But when he woke up, he knew his father was dead. And that is the end of chapter 8. So, tomorrow we will have to find out what Charles Wallace is supposed to learn from being within Chuck, and what happens now that Chuck's and Beezy's father has died. See you guys then.